Before the judge even finished reading the verdict, Harriet Colborne. Wait, that name's taken. Let me think silently and begin properly. The courtroom was so quiet that afternoon that you could hear the snow against the windows. That's the detail Lionel Beaumont's daughter. No, those names are used. Starting fresh, silently picking names now. I need to check the name list carefully before writing. Let me do that first, then deliver the story directly. The names I'll use, verified against the list, internal check only, not shown. Roland Voss, main character 48, black man widower. Simone, taken. Claire Voss, daughter. Mark Voss, son. Secondary, Doug Hallett, Patricia Owen, Judge Aaron Sato. Now the story. The courtroom was so quiet that afternoon that you could hear the snow ticking against the tall windows above the gallery. It was February in Hamilton, Ontario, and the heating system in the old courthouse groaned every few minutes, like it was tired of the whole business, too. Roland Voss sat at the defendant's table, with his hands folded in front of him. His wrists no longer cuffed, because his lawyer had argued successfully that the restraints were prejudicial. Small mercy. He stared at a scratch in the wood of the table and thought about a garden. Specifically, he thought about the vegetable garden he and his late wife Madeline had planted behind the house on Erskine Street 18 years ago. And whether anyone had turned the soil this past autumn, and whether it mattered anymore. He did not look at the gallery. He knew who was back there. He had made himself not look. But before we get to that courtroom, before the verdict and what came after it, before the two young people who walked in from the cold that Tuesday morning and changed everything, we need to go back. Because what happened to Roland Voss did not begin in a courtroom. It began on a Tuesday evening in September, 2 decades earlier, at a community center on Barton Street East, where a man who had recently lost everything tried to figure out how to keep living. Roland had been 41 years old when Madeline died. Pancreatic cancer, 7 weeks from diagnosis to the end, which the doctors said was fast even by the brutal standards of that disease. They had no children. They had tried. They had the kind of marriage that other couples looked at from the outside and felt vaguely inadequate about. Not because Roland and Madeline were showy about their happiness, but because it was so plainly real. He cooked. She did the crossword every morning. He read aloud to her in the evenings. Novels, mostly, and occasionally long magazine articles she found interesting, but couldn't be bothered to read herself. She called him Roll, which no one else was permitted to do. He called her Maddie, which she tolerated only from him. When she was gone, the house on Erskine Street became a problem. Not practically. Roland was an electrician, a good one, and he had work, but atmospherically. The house was full of her, the reading chair, the crossword books stacked on the end table, a half-used bottle of the particular hand cream she bought at the pharmacy on concession. He couldn't throw anything away, and he couldn't stay in the rooms that held these things, so he developed a habit of leaving in the evenings and walking, just walking, around the neighborhood, down to the waterfront, through the parks that were almost empty at that hour. It was on one of these walks that he ended up at the Barton Street Community Center, which was lit up on a Tuesday evening and had a sandwich board outside advertising a volunteer orientation meeting. Roland had not intended to volunteer for anything. He didn't know what he intended. He went inside mostly because it was cold. The coordinator was a woman named Patricia Owen, 60-ish, with reading glasses on a beaded chain around her neck and the efficient manner of someone who had been running this particular operation for long enough that nothing surprised her anymore. She handed Roland a cup of coffee and a photocopied information sheet and explained that the center ran an after-school mentorship program for children in the surrounding neighborhood, many of whom came from homes dealing with poverty, addiction, recent immigration, or some combination of all three. They needed adults who could show up consistently. That was the main requirement, Patricia said. Just show up consistently. Roland showed up. He was matched initially with a group of 4 kids between the ages of 9 and 12. Within 3 weeks, one of the boys had stopped coming. His family had moved, and the remaining 3 rattled around the small room the center allocated to the program, doing homework and playing cards, and occasionally, when Roland managed to organize it, taking a trip somewhere. The Science Center in Toronto, the conservation area up near Dundas, once memorably a hockey game, which none of them had ever attended in person. 2 of the 3 kids eventually cycled out of the program as they got older. But one didn't. Her name was Claire Edith Dunphy. She was 10 when Roland first met her, with her hair in 2 braids that were always slightly uneven, and a habit of correcting adults when they said things that weren't true, which she did not seem to understand was considered rude. She was in the program because her mother had recently entered a treatment facility for substance dependency, and her father was not in the picture. She was living with a grandmother who loved her, but was 73 years old and overwhelmed. Claire was angry in the particular way that children are angry when they've been let down by the people who were supposed to show up. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with a kind of compressed, careful fury that she wore like a second skin. Roland recognized something in it. He didn't say so. He just kept showing up. Over the following months, something shifted, not dramatically, not in a way that made a good scene. Claire started bringing her schoolwork specifically to show him. She argued with him about everything, the rules of card games, the right way to make tea, whether Hamilton was better than Toronto, which was a position Roland held and she disputed passionately. Her grandmother, whose name was Edith, the source of Claire's middle name, called Roland once in the spring to thank him, and he found he couldn't say much in response because he didn't feel like he'd done anything. He'd just been there. Claire's mother, whose name was Sandra Dunphy, completed her treatment program that summer. She was 29 years old, clear-eyed, terrified, and working very hard. She came to the community center to meet Roland formally, and he saw in her face the same compressed wariness he'd seen in Claire's, and understood that it was hereditary in the way that certain emotional responses are. Not genetically exactly, but environmentally, passed down like a habit of flinching when doors slammed. Sandra was transparent with Roland. She told him she didn't know how to be the mother Claire needed, and she was trying to learn. She told him she was glad Claire had someone outside the family who was reliable. She used that word specifically, reliable. He thought about it for days afterward. It seemed like such a small thing to be praised for. He had just kept showing up. Within 2 years, Roland had become something that didn't have a clean name. Not a foster parent, he was never licensed as one. Not an uncle. He had no biological relationship to Claire. Not a mentor exactly, though that had been the original framing. He was the person Claire called when she got a high mark on a test. He was the person Sandra called when she was overwhelmed and needed someone to take Claire for the weekend. He attended school concerts and parent-teacher interviews when Sandra couldn't make it. He was at the kitchen table on Erskine Street, helping Claire with a science project, when she looked up from her Bristol board and said, with the directness of a child who has simply decided something, "I think you're basically my dad, right?" Roland had looked at her for a moment. "I think that's about right," he said. There was a boy, too, eventually, a younger one. His name was Mark Allen Tremblay, though Tremblay was his biological father's name, and Mark didn't use it if he could help it. He was Sandra's nephew, technically, the son of her younger brother who had died of an overdose when Mark was 4. Sandra had taken him in. He was 6 years old when he arrived in the orbit of the house on Erskine Street, which Roland had stopped thinking of as a problem by then and had started thinking of as a home again. Mark was quieter than Claire, more watchful. He took longer to warm up, but he was the one who, eventually, started calling Roland Dad out loud in front of other people, without asking permission, without any discussion, simply because it was what was accurate, and Mark was not interested in saying things that weren't accurate. Roland was 47 when Mark started doing this. He found he couldn't argue with it. The neighborhood they lived in was not unkind. Hamilton had changed a great deal in those years. The old Steeltown identity had given way to something messier and more various, with new restaurants on James Street North and artists moving into the East End and a general sense of complicated civic reinvention. But there were still people who had opinions, neighbors who found ways to mention, with studied casualness, that they'd noticed the children coming and going. People at Roland's church, he attended occasionally, for Madeline's sake more than his own, a habit that had simply continued, who asked questions that were really statements. A man at the bar where he sometimes watched hockey who said, one November evening, "You know those kids are going to have a confusing life, right?" Meaning because they were white and he was black, and that apparently required comment. Roland had looked at the man for a moment and then looked back at the television. He had decided, sometime in Claire's early teens, that he was not going to spend energy on people who required convincing. He spent his energy on the people who were already there. That was all. He was an electrician. He understood circuits. Energy went where it was directed, and he directed his toward the kitchen table on Erskine Street, toward school pickups and packed lunches, and the business of making a household work. Sandra remained involved throughout. She was sober for 11 years, then 12, then 15. She and Roland had a relationship that was genuinely hard to describe, not romantic, not precisely platonic, something that had grown in the particular soil of shared responsibility for children and had its own ecosystem. They bickered. They trusted each other completely. When Sandra was diagnosed with MS in her late 30s, Roland drove her to appointments without being asked. When Roland's truck broke down the winter he was 50, Sandra lent him money without discussion. They were family. There wasn't a cleaner word for it. Claire went to Mohawk College and then transferred to McMaster to finish a degree in social work. She was 24 when she graduated. Roland drove to the ceremony and sat beside Edith, who was 80-something and sharp as ever. And when Claire crossed the stage, the old woman took Roland's hand and held it without saying anything. And he thought that was about as complete as he'd ever felt. Mark was studying automotive technology at a trades college in Guelph. He was going to be a mechanic. He was going to be an excellent mechanic. He had the same quality Roland had recognized in himself as a young man: the patience to understand how things fit together, the willingness to stay with a problem until it made sense. Roland was 53. He had a good life. He had made a good life out of grief and consistency and the slow accumulation of small things. He did not think of himself as remarkable. He thought of himself as someone who had been lucky enough to find out, eventually, what he was for. Then, in October, a man was found dead in the parking lot behind the Wellington Street commercial strip, and everything came apart. The dead man's name was Doug Hallett. He was 48 years old, an electrician as well. Not a colleague of Roland's exactly, but someone in the same trade ecosystem, the kind of person you crossed paths with on jobs, at suppliers, at the occasional industry function. Roland had known him for years in the vague background way of professional acquaintance. Doug was loud. Doug had opinions about things. Doug owed money to people and had a temper that, by several accounts, had gotten worse in recent years. Doug Hallett was found on a Wednesday morning in October, and the cause of death was blunt force trauma. And the last person confirmed to have spoken to him, according to his phone records and 2 witnesses at a bar King Street, was Roland Voss. Roland had, in fact, spoken to Doug that Tuesday evening. They had argued mildly about an outstanding payment for work Roland had done on a shared commercial job the previous spring. It was not a dramatic confrontation. Roland had not been angry. He was, as by most accounts, not a man who did anger the loud way. He had stated what was owed. Doug had been defensive. Roland had left. He had driven home. He had eaten leftover pasta and watched 40 minutes of a documentary about migratory birds and gone to sleep. He had no witnesses for any of this. His truck had been spotted near the Wellington Street area at around 9:15 that evening. The parking lot where Doug Hallett was found was 2 blocks from the bar where they'd spoken. The detective assigned to the case, a man named Sergeant Frederick Lanois, who had a reputation for being thorough in ways that had a tendency to calcify into stubbornness, decided, based on motive, proximity, and the absence of any alibi, that Roland Voss was the person they were looking for. Roland was arrested on a Thursday morning in November. He stood in his kitchen when the officers came, still in his work clothes from the day before, holding a cup of coffee he'd just made. He put the cup down carefully on the counter. He did not argue. He had spent 20 years learning what it cost to lose composure in front of people who were already suspicious of you, and he was not about to begin now. He was charged with second-degree murder. Sandra called a lawyer. Claire came home from her job at a family services agency in Brantford. Mark drove back from Guelph without telling anyone he was coming, simply showed up at the house on Erskine Street and sat at the kitchen table where he had done homework for 15 years, because that was where he put himself when things were serious. The months between the arrest and the trial were the longest Roland could remember since the 7 weeks of Madeline's illness. There was something similar about them, the terrible suspension of ordinary time, the way the days stopped behaving like days and became instead just intervals between updates, between calls from the lawyer, between hearings. He was on bail, which meant he was home on Erskine Street, which meant the kitchen table was still there and the garden was still there. And nothing had changed in any visible way except that everything had changed completely. His lawyer was a woman named Yolanda Ferris, who was 51 years old and had the manner of someone who had heard every possible variation of every possible situation and was not going to be flustered by any of them. She was good. Roland could tell she was good the way he could tell. Within the first 10 minutes on a job, whether an electrician knew what they were doing. She did not promise him things she couldn't guarantee. She told him what they had and what they didn't have, and what they didn't have was evidence that put someone else at the scene. And what they did have was character, testimony, history, the accumulated record of 20 years of a man showing up for people who needed him. "That's not nothing," Yolanda told him. "But I want to be honest with you. Character doesn't acquit. Evidence acquits." There was one piece of evidence that bothered her, and it bothered Roland too when she brought it up. There was a security camera mounted on the exterior of a commercial property on Wellington Street that should, in theory, have captured footage of the parking lot where Doug Hallett was found. The footage, for the relevant time window, was corrupted. The property owner said it happened occasionally with the system they used. Sergeant Lanois's team had examined it and accepted this explanation. Yolanda did not accept it as easily, but there was nothing she could do with a corrupted file except note its absence. What she did have, what she spent 6 months carefully preparing, was this. Roland Voss had bought gas at a station on Upper Wentworth Street at 9:47 on the Tuesday evening in question. The gas station had its own cameras. The footage was intact. The timestamp put Roland 15 minutes away from Wellington Street at a time that, depending on the coroner's window for time of death, was either exculpatory or merely suggestive, not definitive. But something. And then there were the other things. The things that couldn't be photographed or time-stamped. The trial opened on a Tuesday in February. It was, as these things go, a reasonably swift proceeding, 10 days, which felt both fast and interminable. The Crown prosecutor was a compact, precise man named Arthur Peel, who was skilled at making straightforward narratives feel inevitable. He laid out what he had: motive, the unpaid debt; proximity, the truck sighting; and the absence of any alibi for the window in question. He was careful not to overstate. He didn't need to overstate. The absence of a solid alibi was doing most of the work. Yolanda cross-examined methodically. She established that the unpaid debt was approximately $1,200. Not nothing, but not the kind of sum that typically motivated a man with no prior record and 2 decades of stable, documented community involvement to commit murder. She established that trucks matching the description of Roland's were common in that part of the city. She entered the gas station footage into evidence and let it speak. The character witnesses went well. Patricia Owen, now well into her 70s but as organized as ever, took the stand and described the Roland Voss she had known for 18 years. Dependable, consistent, a man who had walked into her community center one February evening looking lost and had become, over the following 2 decades, one of the people she trusted most. Edith Dunphy, who was 84 and used a cane but was not in any other respect diminished, told the court exactly who Roland was and dared anyone present to suggest otherwise. And then, on the 8th day of the trial, Yolanda called 2 witnesses that Arthur Peel had not been expecting. The prosecutor saw them come in from the back of the courtroom that morning and leaned over to speak to his assistant in a low voice. He had been told about them. He had reviewed what they were going to say, but seeing them walk to the front of the room. A woman in her early 30s and a man a few years younger, both moving with the particular deliberateness of people who have prepared themselves for something difficult, produced an expression on Peel's face that people in the gallery described afterward, variously as confused, recalibrating, and briefly unguarded. He had not perhaps fully believed they would actually come. Claire Dunphy took the stand first. She was 32 years old, with her hair pulled back and the same quality of measured precision she'd had since she was 10, except now it was professionally calibrated instead of childlike. She stated her relationship to Roland Voss clearly, not biological, not legally formalized, but real. She had known him for 22 years. She described what those years had looked like from the inside. The science center trips, the homework table, the hockey game, the graduation ceremony, the particular way Roland spoke when he was trying not to show that something had moved him, which was the way he'd spoken at her convocation when she'd found him afterward, standing by the parking lot, looking at the sky. Then she said this. Roland Voss had called her on the evening of the Tuesday in question. Not a text, a call. They'd spoken for 31 minutes, beginning at 9:52, which she could confirm because she still had the call on her phone, had never deleted it, had in fact saved it without knowing why. A habit she'd developed of keeping the long calls because she re-listened to them sometimes. The call had been about Mark, who had been going through a hard patch at school. Roland had wanted to talk through how to support him. They had talked until almost 10:30, and Roland had been at home in the kitchen. She'd heard him making tea at some point, and the kettle was the specific loud one that had been on Erskine Street for 15 years and was unmistakable. The call itself, the phone record, was submitted into evidence. The timestamp placed Roland in a phone call starting approximately 8 minutes after the gas station footage, and continuing well past the outer boundary of the coroner's window for time of death. Arthur Peel cross-examined Claire for 40 minutes and accomplished nothing. Mark Tremblay took the stand next. He was 28 years old, quieter than Claire in public, but no less precise. He confirmed that he had been on the phone with Roland himself earlier that same evening. A shorter call, about 20 minutes, around 8:30, and that Roland had sounded exactly as Roland always sounded, measured, unhurried, a little tired after a long day. Mark had been having trouble with one of his instructors. Roland had listened, he had asked questions. He had said, at the end, that Mark knew what he was capable of, and that other people's assessments of that were never the final word. Mark said this on the stand without looking away from the jury. He said Roland had told him that when he was 12 years old, sitting at a kitchen table in Hamilton, and he had never forgotten it, and he was not going to forget it now, and he was not going to let it go unanswered. There was a sound in the gallery, a kind of collective exhale. Roland Voss, at the defendant's table, looked down at the scratch in the wood, and did not look up for a long moment. Yolanda Ferris had also, in the intervening months, retained a private digital forensics consultant who took a second look at the corrupted footage from the Wellington Street camera. What the consultant found was not a malfunction. The corruption was patterned in a way that suggested deliberate deletion of a specific time window while leaving adjacent footage intact. This finding, submitted on day 9, shifted the shape of the investigation considerably, because it meant either that someone had something to hide or that Sergeant Lenoir's team had accepted an explanation they should not have accepted, or both. The Crown did not have a good answer for this. Peel made his closing argument competently and without conceding anything outright. But the gas station footage, the phone records, and the forensics consultant's report had done their work. The story that had seemed inevitable in November had become, by February, something with holes in it, and the jury had noticed the holes. On the afternoon of the 10th day, after 3 hours and 40 minutes of deliberation, they came back. The courtroom was quiet. The snow had picked up again outside. The heating system groaned. The foreperson, a woman in her 50s with her hands folded in front of her on the rail, who had the look of someone who had thought hard about something and was now going to say it clearly, read the verdict in a voice that carried without being loud. On the charge of second-degree murder, not guilty. Roland did not stand up immediately. He sat for a moment with his hands still folded on the table, in the same position they'd been in for 10 days, and he breathed. Yolanda touched his arm. The room was still processing the sound of what had just been said. Then he turned, for the first time since the trial had begun, and looked at the gallery. Claire was already on her feet. Mark was beside her, one hand on the back of the bench in front of him like he needed something to hold on to. Sandra was next to Mark, tears running down her face in a straightforward, unembarrassed way. Edith, who was 84 years old and had every right to have stayed home that February afternoon, was sitting very straight in the row behind them, her cane across her knees, watching Roland with an expression that said everything that needed saying. He looked at all of them. He thought about the community center on Barton Street East, which was still there, still lit up on Tuesday evenings. He thought about a vegetable garden. He thought about Madeline, who had not lived to see any of this, not the children, not the years, not this room, and who would have found the right words for all of it, in a way he never quite could. He thought that the thing you build is the thing that holds. There are people who will tell you that what Roland Voss did was exceptional, that it takes a particular kind of person to open their life to children who have no claim on it, to show up Tuesday after Tuesday for 20 years without any guarantee that it amounts to anything. Maybe, but here's what the trial record also shows. Claire Dunphy saved a phone call she didn't know she was going to need. Mark Tremblay drove from Guelph without being asked. A woman named Patricia Owen, who is in her late 70s and has been running that community center through funding cuts and a pandemic and a leaky roof and more Tuesday evenings than anyone has counted, still gets up and goes because the kids are still there. None of these are exceptional people in the way stories usually mean that word. They're people who decided at some point that showing up consistently was what they were going to do. And they did it. And when it mattered most, that turned out to be enough. Roland Voss went home to Erskine Street that February evening. The kitchen table was exactly where it had always been. Sandra had made soup. Mark was already eating. Claire was arguing with Mark about whether he'd put enough salt in, which was an argument that was never going to be resolved, which was in its way exactly right. Outside, the snow was still coming down over Hamilton, over the old courthouse, and the community center and the garden that had been turned, after all. Mark had done it last October, quietly, without mentioning it. The light in the kitchen was on.